person provided some blurry photographs to Douglas, who said they did not appear to have been altered. Wildlife officials now just want to talk to the man so that he is aware of the dangers. There's no telling what his intentions are, Douglas said, but it is believed he could just.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arcanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm Chris James, your host. This is June 3rd, 2017, season number 2, episode 22. Before I get started on the show tonight, we just had 4 officers involved in a on-duty incident where they were injured, and unfortunately they were all shipped to San Antonio, Texas for treatment. Now, I understand if you're a police officer and you get hurt in the line of duty, you not only want, but you deserve the very best treatment. My question is, why do our local hospitals not have the ability to treat situations like this? And why do our officers have to be sent to San Antonio anytime they get hurt? Is this life on the border? Or is there some other reason that we don't seem to have that good of medical treatment here in Laredo? Tonight, we're going to be talking about Charles Fort. A lot of people are going to be saying, who's Charles Fort and why do you want to talk about him? What's strange about Charles Fort? Well, once we get to that, you'll understand more. But before we get to Charles Fort, let's talk about another legend that few people know about. But if you're into ghosts, you should know about Luciano. Long before the Laredo Paranormal Research Society, there was the unnamed Ghost Club. Born in Omaha, Nebraska, back in 1923, Luciano Guajardo's family moved to Laredo when he was 3 years old. They lived in the La Azteca neighborhood, and he attended school in many small escuelitas, small schools, where the teachers only spoke Spanish. This led to Mr. Guajardo becoming fluent in both Spanish and in English. Back in the time he was growing up, Mr. Guajardo was exposed to different kinds of thought. Back then, you didn't go to a hospital to be cured. You went there to die. Women of the neighborhood had what they called la oración para ayudar un buen morir, or the prayer for a peaceful death. His mother had a piece of paper, papel de china, or tissue paper, and she kept it safe in a cloth with an outline of a bare foot printed on it. The foot was said to be that of the Virgin Mary. The paper was laid on a dying person's chest, and the women would all pray. Those that witnessed this ceremony say it worked to ease the dying person's pain. The original paper was buried with Luciano's mother when she died. Mr. Guajardo was very interested in history and became friends with Seb Wilcox, who was working on the Laredo archives back in the 40s. Luciano Guajardo was responsible for uncovering the lost 1,500 pages of the WPA, or Works Progress Administration, which had been started by President Roosevelt, and it covered the history of Laredo. It had somehow wound up in Austin. There was a 2-week hearing to decide who was the rightful owner of these papers, and unfortunately I neglected to find out if they made their way back to Laredo or not. I'll have to check up on that in a bit. Mr. Guajardo enrolled at Laredo Junior College, that's Laredo Community College today, and then he went on to the University of Texas in Austin. He took a job as a cataloger at the Laredo Public Library in 1951, and he held that position until 1961 when he was moved to the position of librarian. In 1978, Mr. Guajardo became the director of the library, and he stayed in this position for the next 9 years. Now, one of Mr. Guajardo's favorite subjects was ghosts. He liked reading about them, and he liked looking into reports of ghostly encounters. He was one of the founders of the first ever Laredo Ghost Investigations, but their group was never given an official name. When asked what they called themselves, Mr. Guajardo said, "The newspapers call us the Ghostbusters, but we have no official name." The group, or club as they preferred to call themselves, consisted of between 10 and 12 members. Some were doctors, lawyers, and school teachers. But Mr. Guajardo was the only one willing to go public. The club was formed sometime in 1974, but no one ever bothered to write down the actual date. During an interview for See Laredo back in 1989 by Tom Sullivan, Mr. Guajardo told some interesting stories from his research into the unexplained. The St. Peter's Plaza used to be the home to Mary Help of Christians School. It was run by the Salesian nuns. The school was eventually moved to Del Mar, where it still sits today. The property had been on loan to them, so when the school moved on, the property was rented out to a used clothing store sometime in the 50s or early 60s. La Economica was the name of the store. The owner of the store met with Mr. Guajardo over coffee to tell his bizarre story and see if there was maybe any help that he could receive. It seemed the women working at the store were seeing unexplainable things. A woman dressed in a black outfit would come in around just a few minutes before closing time, and she would ask to see something in the back of the store. Other times, she would ask to use the ladies' room. She was dressed differently each time, and she would speak to the staff in Spanish, always just about closing time. The clerks, when it was time to close, would look around the store trying to find the woman. They were never able to locate her. This was causing them some concern. Knowing Mr. Guajardo was interested in ghosts and thinking perhaps the mystery woman was a phantasma, the owner asked Mr. Guajardo to have a look and see what he could discover. Rounding up the club, Mr. Guajardo began his, or rather their, investigation. Being a history buff, Mr. Guajardo looked into the history of the St. Peter's Plaza. At one time, it had been a cemetery. The club looked into all the possibilities, trying to track down any references to a woman in black. Soon, it was learned a woman had lived in the plaza who had an odd turn of events in her life. A plan was formulated as to how they would investigate this case. The club knew a man who was living in a local nursing home. This man was known for his fractured conversations. He would speak about World War II, talking about what Adolf Hitler was thinking when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Then suddenly he would change his dialogue to the pharaohs of Egypt. He was what is known as a kaha, or a box, used by spirits to communicate with the world. As one spirit would exit his body, a second would enter, thus leading to his very broken conversations. Now we're going to take a break here and play a couple commercials. We'll be right back, so don't go away. You're listening to Arcanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Are you looking for a great cup of coffee, but you just don't know where to look? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 1002 Iturbide, Suite number 7. They serve only the best coffee around. Not into coffee? They also have a wide selection of teas. It's a great place to meet friends or just spend time with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Trike. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. Now, we were just talking about that incident going on at St. Peter's Plaza. The plan was to have the gentleman enter the store just before closing time, and then he was going to remain there after the place was locked up. This was not the first time the club had worked with this man. The club went to the Economica late in the afternoon and then watched as the clerks began to close up for the evening. Everyone left the store except for the man known as the Caja. The door was locked, and the club waited outside, anxious to see what the exercise would bring. From the darkened store, they heard the sound of a conversation taking place. The Caja was speaking, and sometimes he was yelling at another person in the store. Then, finally, the Caja gave the prearranged signal to be let out, and he had something to tell the club. As it turned out, the woman in black had lived in the property back in the 1800s. She had been a very jealous woman, especially when it came to her one and only son. She would drive off or scare off any would-be suitors, any girls that tried to come between her and her offspring. She considered all young men to be sinvergüenza, or shameless. They're just trying to get his or her money. One day, her son had to go to San Antonio on business. It is uncertain what happened, but he died while on the trip. His body was shipped back to Laredo for burial. The mother was there at the funeral, but soon after, she refused to or was unable to remember that her son was no longer alive. While the nuns were occupying the building, the woman in black had no issues with them. They obviously were not there to appropriate her loved one. Only once the young clerks came into the property did the ghost of the woman in black have cause to keep an eye on things. The Caja had convinced the lady in black. The women working at the store were either happily married or not in the market for a consort. He spent some time reasoning with the ghost. It would seem he had been successful. The ghost didn't visit the store after that. And not until the store moved on and the school district took possession of the building. The stories began to spread of weird and unexplained things going on in the Laredo Independent School District's offices. The folks working there didn't want any publicity, so they did their best to ignore the sights and sounds going on around them. But needless to say, Mr. Guajardo was not invited to have a look. The school district did decide to make a documentary about the former owner of the property, strictly from a historical standpoint. No ghosts or any spirits, just the story of the woman who had died, believing her son was being pursued by freeloading women. Mr. Guajardo, being the best historian, was invited to participate. The crew assembled and they began filming. Surprisingly, the crew consisted of all men. They moved about the building, filming as they went, until the man holding the cue cards fell and injured his hand. The documentary was held up until a replacement could be found. A young woman came in to work as the cue holder. Things got interesting. A window opened on its own, allowing a gust of wind to blast through the building. The room where the window was located was filled with books, and there was no way anyone could get in there to open or close it. The camera stopped working. The girl holding the cues found all the cards were mixed up, making the storyline completely out of order. The filming came to an abrupt halt. It was decided that perhaps the girl should leave, and so she did. The cameras came back on. The mistake stopped happening, and the wind stopped blowing. The injured cue holder did his best to carry on. Another story Mr. Guajardo told during the interview pertained to a railroad worker's family. The family had been living in Chicago when the father was injured while at work. The company investigated, but they determined there was no reason to compensate the injured worker. The father passed away and he was buried in Nuevo Laredo. The family moved back to Laredo, and shortly thereafter they were invited to the Railroad Commission claim review in Austin, Texas. They had to leave early in the morning since it was a 3-hour drive, so the widow and her daughter and son-in-law decided to stop in Pearsall for breakfast. The daughter sat at the table and waited as her mother and husband headed to the bathrooms. The waitress asked, "Would you like to order now?" And the daughter replied, "No, I'll wait till the whole family is here." Soon her mother and husband returned, but the waitress didn't come to take their order. After waiting too long, they waved the waitress over to get started. The waitress said, "But what about the old man with you? Don't you want to wait for him?" "What old man?" "It's just the 3 of us," they told the waitress. "Well, when you walked in, there was an old man with you, and he said, 'Don't forget to get a hold of my friend. He lives in Austin on 4th Street. He knows about the accident.'" The waitress was confused as the family. The description she gave had matched the father. Well, finally, after leaving the restaurant, they proceeded to Austin, where they were able to track down her father's friend. The friend was able to give enough testimony to cause the Railroad Commission to award the widow a hefty settlement. If not for the unseen old man speaking loud enough for the waitress to hear, the widow may have returned to Laredo penniless. Mr. Guajardo drove to Pearsall to talk to this waitress. She confirmed everything that the family had told him. Mr. Guajardo had said, "There are 2 kinds of people in this world: those who believe in ghosts and those who do not. If those of you who believe in ghosts were asked to tell why you believe, it would take an hour, maybe 2 or 3, for you to tell why you believe in ghosts. Those that do not believe, it would take maybe 3 or 4 seconds. All you could say is, I don't believe in ghosts because I've never seen one. How do you know you've never seen a ghost? How do you know the man or woman you see standing on Santa Maria Street corner is not a ghost? I'm sure that you've seen a man or woman somewhere that every time you went by, there he or she was. Maybe she's waiting for you and you think she's waiting for the bus. It could be that certain hour she becomes visible to certain people. When asked if he believed in seances, Mr. Guajardo said, "No, however, we have been to some." He then went on to explain, "The difference is we've done some research. One of the greatest ghost hunters was Harry Houdini. Houdini was the greatest escape artist of all times. Houdini's mother died while he was away. Because of travel and distance, he never got to his mother's funeral in time. We have read many books that Houdini never believed any of the mediums that proposed to have made contact with his mother. The language, Italian, that his mother spoke was never revealed in the spirit, but they would say it was his mother. He always said, 'Why is my mother speaking English? She doesn't know English.'" Mr. Guajardo ended his interview by saying, "The only advice I'd like to give is, if you ever feel the presence of something scary or unusual around you, try to talk to them. Just stand in the corner and ask, 'Can I help you? What can I do for you? What do you want?' Don't expect the spirit to answer, 'I want you to go light a candle for me.' Nothing like that will happen, but do try to make contact." Mr. Guajardo worked for the city of Laredo for 35 years. Many people remember him as the librarian and as the historian. My wife Lourdes interviewed him while working on her research paper for the Laredo State University. Her paper was on the history of Laredo. She says Mr. Guajardo was the nicest person she had ever met. Nicer than me. I arrived in Laredo in 1988, and never having the opportunity to meet the man who became the legend. I'm sure a few of you out there are saying, "Who was Charles Fort and what makes his life a strange thing?" Let's take a look at his history and then you'll know how all things bizarre became an investigation. Charles Oy Fort was born August 6, 1874, in Albany, New York. His father was Dutch and considered to be very strict, even by those standards. Let's just say Ford didn't have a fun childhood. This is believed to be the basis of his distrust of any kind of authority. As Fort grew up, his dislike of rules and regulations grew as well. This might have been the key to his looking into things most people, especially scientists, would scoff at or dismiss. In school, Charles was considered to be a curious and intelligent, but less than proper student. He tended to ignore his studies in favor of his own interests. Charles Fort wanted to become a naturalist. He studied nature, along with plants and animals, finding this preferable to what others told him he should be studying. He collected seashells and minerals in his spare time. What Charles didn't learn in school, he picked up through books. He read anything he could get his hands on about the world, nature, and the bizarre as well. Charles spent as much time poring over books and newspapers at the library. He took copious notes on everything he read. At one point, later in his life, he says he threw away 48,000 pages of notes, which amounted to just a small portion of his collection. As soon as Charles turned 18, he left home to embark on a world tour to learn as much as he could about the things that interested him. He started out traveling about the United States so he'd have a better knowledge of the country he lived in. Once he'd seen most of the West and South, he headed to England and Scotland. When he needed money, he would take any jobs available. His father had owned a grocery store, and Charles had worked there when not in school. This had given him a few skills to find work when he needed money. At some point, Fort became sick while traveling through South Africa. Not sure what he picked up, but it was bad enough he had to return home. A close friend of his, Anna Filling, took on the job of nursing Charles back to health. She was 4 years his senior, but they decided to get married and see if they couldn't make a life together. Fort began writing as a means of making money, but this only brought in a few dollars. The couple were considered not just poor, but impoverished. Anne didn't share his quest for knowledge. She was more into movies and parakeets. Charles Fort wrote 10 novels, but only one was ever published. It was called The Outcast Manufacturers, and it came out in 1909. The book received good reviews, but it never made it to the level of others like H.G. Wells or Jules Verne. By 1915, the Fort began to write 2 books titled X and Y. The first book, X, was under the idea that beings on Mars were controlling events on the Earth. The second book, Y, went with the idea that there was a sinister civilization living in Antarctica that had some nasty intentions for the rest of the planet. These 2 books caught the attention of a writer named Theodore Dresser, who tried to help Fort get them published. Unfortunately, the publishers at the time were not interested in either book. Fort, in a state of depression, burned both manuscripts. Things were looking very bad for our hero. His best efforts were getting him nowhere. And with that, we're going to take a break and play a couple commercials. We'll be right back after this, so don't go away. You're listening to Arcanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Are you looking for a great cup of coffee, but you just don't know where to look? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 1002 Iturbide, Suite number 7. They serve only the best coffee around. Not into coffee? They also have a wide selection of teas. It's a great place to meet friends or just spend time with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Trike. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not gonna take this anymore!
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. We left off with Charles Fort not feeling so good about his writing, very depressed, and him and his wife were pretty much looking at starvation if something didn't happen soon. 1916, an uncle died and left Charles a small inheritance. It was enough to allow him to quit the many jobs he'd been taking so he could focus on writing instead. Charles' brother, Clarence, passed away the next year, and the brother's inheritance was divided between Charles and his other brother, Raymond. Then in 1919, in a sudden burst of inspiration, Fort began working on a book called The Book of the Damned. This book was a catchy title. It was his first try at nonfiction. It dealt with things like UFOs and strange things seen falling from the sky. Rain of flightless animals and things have been reported throughout history. In the 1st century A.D., Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder documented storms of frogs and fish falling from the sky. 1794, French soldiers witnessed toads falling from the sky during heavy rains in La Lane, near the French city of Lille. Rural inhabitants in Yoro, Honduras, claimed fish rain happened there every summer, the phenomenon they called lluvia de peces. The title damned did not refer to hell, but was the idea that certain ideas were condemned by modern science, to never be looked into due to their strange manifestations. Such things as frogs and fish falling from the sky. Even back then, people talking about weird lights in the sky were considered to be untrustworthy. It wasn't until the 1940s that people began to take sightings seriously. In the Book of the Damned, Fort discusses numerous unexplained phenomena, many of which would today be categorized as UFOs. Fort gives examples of many other strange happenings as well. Aside from fish falling from the sky or rain that looks like blood, there are also reports of finding of thunderstones, which supposedly fell from the sky during lightning storms. A discussion of evidence for the existence of giants, things like huge oversized axes that were too big for any person to use, and fairies, the kind with wings. He also has a chapter on poltergeist phenomenon. Fort attempted to construct a cosmos which would explain these bizarre occurrences. He proposed that the Earth's gravity only extended about 20 miles from the planet. Just beyond our gravity were enormous lands floating above the Earth. These lands were unseen by humans for whatever reason you want to think. A few of the floating lands were inhabited by giant beings. Some folks asked, if there is life in the universe, how come we aren't visited by aliens? This is known as the Fermi paradox, proposed by Enrico Fermi in the 1950s. Back in 1919, Fort gave his solution to this paradox 30 years before it was advanced. Fort said, "I think we're property." Fort said that the Earth was fought over in ancient times, and now we're under the control of something or someone, and all the other beings have been warned off. The reason, Fort said, that we never meet our owners is that they have no interest in talking to their livestock. Fort wrote about giant airships being sighted all over the world long before heavier-than-air flight was established. These sightings have been reported, but the mainstream scientists have ignored them because they didn't fit into the world the way they had envisioned it, just like today. The funny thing was, the scientists all had come up with explanations for these sightings. Things like swamp gas and ball lightning. By World War I, the scientists were all blaming Germany as being the culprits for everything. So not only have there been mysterious lights in the sky long before the initial UFO flap of the 1940s, the powers that be have likewise attempted to dismiss these reports in similar terms for a long time. Fort went on to say, I suspect that in other worlds or in other parts of one existence, there is an esoteric knowledge of human beings of this earth, kept back from common knowledge. There have been suggestions of an occult control upon the minds of the inhabitants of this earth. Let anybody who does not like the idea that his mind may be most subtly controlled without his knowledge of it, think back to what propagandists did with his beliefs in the years 1914 to 1918. Charles was referring to the British propagandists who wrote about how well the war was going for the Allies and how the German army was vastly outgunned and outthought. After a while, even the Germans began to believe these fairy tales. The so-called news agencies were even instrumental at making everybody blame the Germans for starting World War I, when in reality, the whole thing got started between Austria and Serbia. Charles Fort was not only looking into UFOs and other strange things, he was spearheading the charge into what today is a very big phenomenon. 1923, Fort published his second nonfiction book, New Lands. Now he was becoming somewhat of a celebrity. People knew his name, and his books were selling. At long last, the couple had some money coming in. They moved to London in 1924. The move wasn't just to see England. Charles wanted access to the British Museum so he could go over all the reports of strange activity that the scientists were all ignoring. By 1926, Fort had exhausted the museum's collection, so they moved back to the U.S., moving into an apartment in the Bronx. Once back in New York, Fort spent many hours at the New York Library, checking out any and all of their unusual books or papers. He would write plenty of notes, amassing the largest collection of oddities from any source he could find. Other writers began to look at him as a peer. Charles and Anna were invited to get-togethers at all the other writers' homes, and they often had some of the folks over to their place. 1931 saw the publishing of book number 3, Lo. Lo is used to call attention or to express wonder or surprise, as in look. Lo, there is a giant badger attacking your house. We don't use lo much these days. Book number 3, Fort develops a theme of teleportation as an agency for many strange phenomena. He reviews the cases of the Marie Celeste, Princess Carabo, Cagliostro, Italian name, Ambrose Bierce. Ambrose Bierce was also a writer. He served as lieutenant in the Union Army during the Civil War. Ambrose Bierce wrote many odd and unusual stories about other dimensions and strange beings. Then, one day in 1914, Ambrose Bierce went missing. He vanished without a trace. The so-called authorities say he died in the Chihuahua Desert, but there was never a body or a trace found. Charles Fort also wrote about Agatha Christie, Kaspar Hauser. Kaspar Hauser was a German youth who is said to have grown up in total isolation in a darkened cell. He was mysteriously transported to Nuremberg, Germany, where he was rehabilitated into society, but he was later killed by some strange man who stabbed him to death. Fort continued to tweak scientific pomposity, focusing on astronomers. While most astronomers will tell you astronomy is an exact science, even today, with the internet and digital computers, calculations can go wrong. Take, for example, the Mars probe. It crashed into the surface after launch because half the scientists were using metric, while the other half were using feet and inches. This just proves even if you belong to the exact science, mistakes will happen. Yes, the computer will give you exactly what you ask, but what if you mistype one letter or number? It is known as a keystroke error, and once it happens, everything is messed up. I was a paramedic for 16 years. On my identification card, my middle initial is a J. My middle name is Lee. Someone at the office in Austin mistyped my name, and it was far easier to just leave it than to go through all the hoops trying to get it fixed. While multi-bodied star systems can now be simulated using computers, eventually chaos creeps in and makes predicting future locations of planets impossible. Fort uses this Achilles heel to advance his own modest cosmological proposal of a shell of land just a few dozen miles up with the stars as volcanoes. I know this sounds a bit weird, but remember, Fort refused to accept mainstream scientists' teachings, and so he would hammer together anything to avoid their ideas. Now, Fort was vindicated in many large and small ways. He predicted the space race and how space travel would someday become commercialized and routine. His sense that the universe has a lot of strange components that early 20th century scientists had no concept of was also sustained. Today, we use parallel universes to explain many strange phenomena. In fact, some mainstream theories of physics demand the existence of such universes. Fort discovered one day he had become the subject of a cult following. People were acting as if he were a rock star. They hadn't come up with that term yet, since rock and roll wouldn't come about for another 20 or so years. He found the idea somewhat comical that people would write to him asking for advice and explanations for all manner of oddball activities. Charles Fort was a decent guy, and so he made an effort to write back to each and every one of his fans. Soon, others were following in his footsteps. Groups were forming all over the United States and Europe, all looking into bizarre reports of anything from ghosts to talking chickens. The Fortean Society was initiated at the Savoy Plaza Hotel in New York City on 26th of January 1931 by some of Fort's friends, many of whom were significant writers, such as Theodore Dreiser, Ben Hecht, Alexander Woolcott, and organized by fellow American writer Tiffany Thayer, half in earnest and half in the spirit of great good humor, like the works of Fort himself. Fort was finding it more difficult to look into things as his health and his eyesight were beginning to go. He didn't trust doctors, so Fort never visited anyone to see about his failing body. After collapsing on May 3, 1932, Fort was taken to the Royal Hospital in the Bronx. As he was slipping away, his publisher visited and showed Charles an advance copy of his fourth book, Wild Talents. Charles Fort died later that day. The last book, Wild Talents, deals with paranormal abilities of human beings, such as poltergeists, fire starters, telekinesis, dowsing, and so on. These accounts are often scraped from the police blotter of the newspapers which Fort used as his primary source of material. This gives a true crime feel to his last volume. Many of these incidents center around some spooky little girl, today a very familiar staple of a lot of horror movies. And once again, we're going to take a break, play a couple commercials, and drink some coffee, so don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arcanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Are you looking for a great cup of coffee, but you just don't know where to look? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 1002 Iturbide, Suite number 7. They serve only the best coffee around. Not into coffee? They also have a wide selection of teas. It's a great place to meet friends or just spend time with a good book. The Organic Man Coffee Trike. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back. Ford liked to call these abilities witchcraft. He also lumped much of modern science, particularly medical science and quantum physics, into witchcraft as well. He proposed that these talents would eventually be acknowledged and placed into use, particularly by the military. An absurd concept at the time. Today, in the 21st century, self-professed witches are a major religious movement. The Pentagon and the Russians are known to have dabbled in remote viewing, and science is proposing even more bizarre and often unsustainable theories of everything. Another term Fort came up with was teleportation. It is still being used today. As Fort's note, of which there are 60,000 pages, they were donated to the New York Public Library after Fort's death. The critics began to circle like sharks at a shipwreck. They began to claim Fort didn't really believe any of what he had wrote. They said Fort was only in it for the money and that his writing was atrocious. Some went so far as to say that Charles Fort was a patron of crank. They compared him to Robert Ripley. But the fans lived on. Soon, societies began popping up here and there. They went by such name as Disciples of Fort. They took the name Fortians. The work of Charles Fort became their work. The Fortians began looking into all manner of paranormal. The term paranormal came into being around 1920. The word consists of two parts, para and normal. The definition implies that scientific explanation of the world around us is normal, and anything that is above, beyond, or contrary to that is para. I like the ghost hunters saying, it's not your normal paranormal. The International Fortean Organization, INFO was formed during the early 1960s, and it was incorporated in 1965 by the brothers and writers Ron and Paul Willis, who acquired much of the material of the original Fortean Society, which had begun during 1932 in the spirit of Charles Fort, but which had largely ceased by 1959 with the death of Tiffany Thayer. Info publishes the Info Journal, the Science and the Unknown, and organizes the Fort Fest, the world's first and continuously running conference on anomalous phenomena dedicated to the spirit of Charles Fort. Info, since the 1960s, also provides audio CDs and film DVDs. Other Fortean societies are also active, notably the Edinburgh Fortean Society in Edinburgh and on the island of Wight. If you'd like to attend Fort Fest, it will be June 24th and 25th in Lithicum, Maryland. You can go to their website, eventbrite.com/e/info-fortfest-june-24-25-2017-tickets. I will try to put the info on my Facebook page after the show. That's Strange Things with Chris James for those of you on Facebook. The magazine, Fortean Times, was first published in November 1973, is a proponent of the Fortean journalism, combining humor, skepticism, and serious research into subjects which scientists and other respectable authorities often disdain. Even though Charles Fort was born and lived most of his life in the United States, the magazine comes to us from England. This makes buying a copy somewhat of an ordeal. I have gone to many a bookstore and newsstand and asked for Fortean Times. The clerk would invariably hand me a copy of 14. Do I look like the kind of guy who would buy such a thing? Since I'm almost always wearing a t-shirt with a UFO or an alien on it. I still find a copy now and then, usually whenever I'm driving through Corpus Christi. I have to drive 140 miles just to buy a magazine. If you'd like to read parts of Charles Fort's books, go to www.sacredtext.com/fort/index.htm, and you can find most of each of his books. And yes, you can buy the complete collection of all 4 books at Amazon.com. You will recall my mentioning Ambrose Bierce while talking about disappearances. Ambrose Gwinnett Bierce was born on June 24, 1842, in a log cabin at Horse Cove Creek, Ohio. His parents were poor but literary couple who instilled in him a deep love for books and writing. At the outset of the Civil War, Bierce enlisted in the Union Army's 9th Indiana Infantry. He participated in operations in Western Virginia in 1861, and he was present at the Battle of Philippi. He received a lot of newspaper attention for his daring rescue, while under fire, of a gravely wounded comrade at the Battle of Rich Mountain. In February 1862, he was commissioned a first lieutenant and served on the staff of General William Babcock Hazen as a topographical engineer. Their job was to make maps of possible battle sites. See, back then, you couldn't just go to a atlas and pull up a map of the area you're about to march into. You had to send people ahead, They had to look over the site. Then they had to get out their pencils and paper, and they had to literally draw you a map showing where everything was. And that's what Bierce was doing. Bierce fought at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, which was a terrifying experience that became a source for several short stories and the memoirs, What I Saw of Shiloh. As a staff officer, Bierce became known to leading generals such as George H. Thomas and Oliver Howard, both of whom supported his application for admission to West Point in May of '64. General Hazen believed Bierce would graduate from the military academy with distinction. But in June 1864, Bierce sustained a serious head wound at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, and he spent the rest of the summer on furlough, returning to active duty September. He was discharged from the Army in January 1865. His military career resumed, however, in mid-1866, when he joined General Hazen as part of an expedition to inspect military outposts across the Great Plains. The expedition traveled by horseback and wagon from Omaha, Nebraska, arriving towards the year's end in San Francisco, California. The Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroad companies had both received some very substantial low interest loans from the U.S. government to build the first transcontinental railroad. The Central Pacific executive, Collis P. Huntington, had persuaded a friendly member of Congress to introduce a bill excusing the companies from having to repay their loans. This amounted to $130 million, which today would have been about $3.74 billion. January 1896, Hearst dispatched Bierce to Washington, D.C. to foil this attempt. The essence of the plot was secrecy. The railroad's advocates hoped to get the bill through Congress without any public notice or hearings. When the angered Huntington confronted Bierce on the steps of Capitol and told Bierce, "Name your price," Bierce answered by saying, "My price is $130 million. If, when you're ready to pay, I happen to be out of town, you may hand it over to my friend, the Treasurer of the United States." His answer was written up in the newspaper as being somewhat of a historic and heroic stand. Bierce's coverage of the diatribes on the subject aroused such public wrath that the bill was immediately defeated. Bierce returned to California in November, and the railroad tycoons were forced to repay the money that they owed. Back then, writers would romanticize about battles as if it were fun and heroic. They told about bravery and acts of daring do. This is why so many young men were inclined to join the military. Bierce, on the other hand, wrote realistically of the terrible things he had seen in war, such as the stories as the occurrence in Owl Creek Bridge, A Horseman in the Sky, One of the Missing, and Chickamauga. His grimly realistic cycle of 25 war stories has been called the greatest anti-war document in American literature. He was not a pacifist, but he did tell the truth about just how bad combat could be. In October 1913, Bierce, then aged 71, departed from Washington, D.C. for a tour of his old Civil War battlefields. By December, he had passed through Louisiana and Texas and crossing by way of El Paso in New Mexico, which was in the throes of a revolution. In Ciudad Juarez, He joined up with Pancho Villa's army as an observer, and in that role, he witnessed the Battle of Tierra Blanca. Bierce is known to have accompanied Villa's army as far as the city of Chihuahua. His last known communication with the world was a letter he wrote there to Blanche Partington, a close friend, dated December 26, 1913. After closing the letter by saying, "As to me, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination," he vanished without a trace. His disappearance became one of the most famous in American literary history. Where did Ambrose Bierce get to? Did he step through a porthole into another dimension? In one of his stories, The Difficulty of Crossing a Field, Ambrose tells about a landowner who, as he was walking across the field, vanished into thin air, right before a number of witnesses. The witnesses all searched the area, but the landowner was never found. As the years went by, people claimed to hear the man talking, as if from a far distance. The odd thing about this story is it is supposed to have been true. The incident took place outside of Selma, Alabama, in July 1854. The landowner was named Williamson. Now I can only ask, did Ambrose Bierce find a difficulty crossing the Chihuahuan Desert? I hope you enjoyed the show and learned something about the legends of paranormal. Next Saturday, we'll be talking about asylums of death. If this sounds like something you and your friends would like to hear, spread the word. All the past shows can be found at strangethings.podomatic.com. If you'd like to contact me to suggest a show or just to say hi, you can write to me at strangethings@arcanasa.com. And now the shows are being placed on YouTube for those of you that prefer YouTube. There's no video, just a picture and the sound of my voice. Till next time, this is Chris James with Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.